Hi kids, I hope you guys had a great start to your school year. This week we are going to continue our new lessons on the exilic characters in the Bible. To do this, we're going to do three things. Okay, we're going to start by reviewing. We're going to review what we learned last week in our lesson. Then we're going to learn a new story. And then lastly, we're going to think. We're going to think about what does this story teach us about God and our relationship to God. So let's start with the review. Does anyone remember what we mean by exilic characters? Exilic characters. Does anyone remember what that means? Well, it's talking about the characters in the Bible that lived in the exile. Got another question for you. Does anyone remember what the exile was? Okay, those are two big words, exilic and exile. Does anyone remember what the word exile means, or what was the exile? Remember, it was the time in the history of Israel and Judah in which they were taken from their land and they were brought to a new land or to another land. They were brought to another country. The kingdom of Israel was exiled or taken to Assyria, and the kingdom of Judah was exiled or taken to Babylon. This would have been extremely hard for the Israelites, for the people of Judah to be taken to a new land. Maybe some of you guys that have moved to a new house or have moved to a new city could relate with the Israelites and the people of Judah in some ways in how they were exiled. Do you remember last week we learned about how this happened? Okay, remember we had 3 news clips and we had 2 news reporters that we got to watch their news report. You remember these guys? Yeah, they brought us the news and we got to see some news reports from the period in which we're talking about the exile, and these 2 news reporters were reporting the news of that time. And we learned a lot of what happened in the exile. We even learned about who caused the exile. Does anyone remember who caused the exile? Might be a bit surprising, but remember, it was God. We learned that God was the one who ultimately put his people in exile. But we learned the reason. It wasn't just random. It wasn't just because for no reason, but it was because they sinned. God was punishing them by putting them in exile. So today we're going to begin looking at some of these characters that lived in the time of the exile. And you guys, I think, probably will know some of these characters. And today's character especially, I think many of you guys have heard about before. His name is Daniel. Daniel. Has anyone ever heard of Daniel? Well, he would have just been a little older in age than some of you guys. So he's right around your age. And we're going to be learning about Daniel, the character in the Bible who lived in the exile. He's going to be our first exilic character. So let's move on to the second thing we're going to do. We're going to learn a new story, and specifically a story about Daniel, the character in the Bible. So the story of Daniel is found in our Bibles in the book that is actually named after him. Okay, there is a book in our Bibles called the Book of Daniel, and that is where Daniel's story is found. So if you could turn in your Bibles with me to the book of Daniel. Now this is kind of a harder book to find in our Bibles. So let's just go over the books of the Bible till we get to the book of Daniel. Okay, we have Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Then we have Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. Then we have Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, and then there's our book, Daniel. All right, so Daniel is a little bit past the middle of our Bibles. So we're going to be in the book of Daniel this week, and that is where we're going to find Daniel's story is recorded. Now, the book of Daniel doesn't start by telling us about Daniel immediately, but it actually starts by telling us what was happening in the world in the time that Daniel lived, and specifically telling us about the exile. Okay, we learned about that last week. We're going to continue to learn about the exile. But we find Daniel's book opens up by talking about the exile of Judah in specific. Okay, the exile of Israel had already happened. It's talking about the exile of Judah. And we're told that King Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, captured and took over the kingdom of Judah. But we're told something surprising in Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 through 2. So if you look there with me, we'll read these two verses. Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 through 2. It says, "In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it." And then it says this, pay careful attention. "And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hands, with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God." So I hope you caught that. Okay, I hope you caught the surprising part of these verses. And the surprising part of these verses is we are told once again that it was God who's at work, that God was in control, that God ultimately gave the king of Judah over to the king of Babylon. Okay, so again it said the Lord gave King Jehoiakim into the hands of King Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, this word gave. Okay, this word gave is a very important word to pay attention to. Okay, very important word that we're going to actually see is repeated 2 other times in this one chapter. Okay, so we're going to be coming back to this word gave. But again, God gave the king, he gave the people of Judah into the hands of another country. He exiled them because of their sin. Now we come to Daniel. Daniel lived in Judah, so when Babylon came and took over, Daniel was taken. Daniel was part of a special group, though, that was brought to King Nebuchadnezzar himself. I need you to pause for just a moment, all right? I need everyone to pause, and I want you to close your eyes. So if everyone could close their eyes with me, okay? Is everyone's eyes closed? All right, so keep your eyes closed and imagine this. Imagine you are brought to a king's palace. Okay, imagine that palace, what it would look like. Now picture you are sitting at a dining table and the food is brought out. But you have never seen this food before, and all the people around you are speaking a different language, a language that you do not know. In this place, you have to still go to school. Okay, so you're taken to this palace, and eventually you still have to go to school, and you're learning things that you've never learned before. You're even learning this new language that you don't know how to speak. Oh yeah, and picture this. So keep your eyes closed and picture this. You are given a new name. So people no longer call you by the name your parents gave you, but they're calling you a name that you've never heard before. Okay, you can open your eyes. Hopefully you guys were able to picture some of those things. Hopefully you were able to picture what that situation would have felt like. Okay, maybe you thought about that, what it would have felt like to be given a new name, or to eat foods that you've never seen before and maybe don't even like. That would have been a very new and different situation. And that's a very similar situation that our character Daniel was brought into when his country of Judah was exiled. So he's taken to the king's palace. He's given the king's food to eat. He's made to go to the Babylonian school. He's taught the language of the Babylonians. His name is changed. And remember, though, Daniel was captured. Okay? In one sense, he was a prisoner. He no longer was with his family. He's no longer with his friends. He's taken with this special group of young men, okay, around his age. He's taken with them away from his family to the king's palace. This would have been a very, very tough situation for Daniel, being so young. I want to ask you this question. So think about this with me. How do you think Daniel is going to handle all of this? Okay, how do you think he's going to handle this? How do you think he's going to react to these things? I'll ask you a few questions. Do you think he's going, or I'll give you a few options. Do you think he's going maybe to start crying? Do you think he's going to start crying because he's so scared? Do you think he's going to say, no, I'm not going to do any of those things. I'm not getting a new name. I'm not eating the king's food, and really being rebellious or going against it in a pretty mean fashion? Do you think he's going to give in and do exactly what they want him to do? Oh yeah, and by the way, I haven't mentioned this. Maybe this was obvious, or maybe even you thought of this from last week, but King Nebuchadnezzar in this city of Babylon where Daniel was taken, they worshiped idols. Okay, here's a picture of some of the idols that we're going to actually see in the weeks to come that they worshiped. Okay, there's them bowing down to these idols. All right, if you can see the people bowing down to that golden statue. Okay, these are people who worshiped idols. So I might ask you the question, do you think Daniel will serve idols? Okay, we haven't been told anything about Daniel's faith so far, if he believes and serves God. Well, we're going to find that out in our lesson today. So we find out the answer to all of these questions specifically in Daniel chapter 1. Okay, that's where our story is going to come from today. And we see Daniel, he's living in Babylon, he's learning how to become a leader in Babylon, and we're specifically told in Daniel chapter 1 verse 8, so if you look at verse 8 with me, it says this, "But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself." Okay? That's a very important verse as we come to Daniel and as we think about how he's going to react to all of these things. We see here that Daniel decided that he would be going against God and his word if he ate the king's food. Okay, if he ate the king's food. All right, so the king's food probably wasn't a cheeseburger and fries, but it probably was something that tasted very good. Okay, if you like cheeseburger and fries like I do, this would have probably been very delicious food that the king was given. And Daniel decided or thought that it would have been sin for him to eat this food. So he was not willing to disobey God. And this would have been huge because remember, Daniel was surrounded by others who were eating this food. Remember, Daniel isn't in a position that he can say no because he's a prisoner. Okay, he needs to do what the king says that he needs to do. But he does this because of his relationship with God. So I ask you, are there things that you have not done because of your relationship with God? Others might be doing them. It might actually be something that you would enjoy, but have you decided not to do it? Just like Daniel, because of your relationship with God. Well, I want to give you a quick story from my life. When I was in school, my class went on a field trip, and it was a field trip that we slept overnight at a camp. And I remember us in the cabin at night. The rest of the boys in my cabin were up, and I remember a lot of them started to swear, and a lot of them started to say words that shouldn't be said. Okay, that God calls us not to say. And I remember a lot of them were talking in ways like this. And I remember in this situation, I had a choice. Do I talk like my classmates? Do I talk like my friends? Or do I decide to not talk that way? To not swear and say some of these words because God has called us not to, okay? Do I decide to try and look cool? Or do I maybe risk the chance to be made fun of? I was put in this situation on this class field trip. And thankfully, God helped me to not say these things, to not say some of these swear words on this field trip. So this was a very hard thing that Daniel did. So I want to encourage you guys, don't give in to living in a way that would not please God just because others around you are, okay? Don't give in to living in some of these ways just because your friends are, just because it would be the cool thing to do. Well, as we move on in the story, we're told this. In Daniel 1, chapter 1, verse 9, it says, "And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs." Did you notice? There's our word gave again. For a second time, we have our word gave. Okay? Second time of 3. But this is a very important word because we see God gave. God was ultimately in control of Daniel and his situation. In the person that was over Daniel, we're told that he gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the eunuch. So we see God helping Daniel in that ultimately Daniel and the man in charge of him work out a plan that Daniel ends up not having to eat the king's food. All right, so they work out a plan. So God helps it be that he doesn't have to eat the king's food, but instead they work it out that he can eat vegetables. Okay, that he doesn't have to eat the king's food anymore, but he can eat vegetables instead. So we see Daniel chapter 1 ends by telling us this. We're told in verse 17, okay, again, look for our word gave. In verse 17 of Daniel chapter 1, it says, as for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. So once again, we see God gave. God gave them abilities. He gave them gifts, helping them to ultimately have success in the kingdom of Babylon. So much so that they were seen to be 10 times better than any of the other servants of King Nebuchadnezzar. So God was watching over Daniel. God was in control of Daniel's, in one sense, terrible situation. He's brought away from his family. He's brought away from his country and his friends. And God is with him and providing for him in this time. So let's close our lesson by thinking about what does this story teach us about God and our relationship to God. All right, I want to give you 2 things. The first starts with a lesson that we can learn about God. Let's go to this word gave for a last time, okay? Our word gave. We saw this 3 times in one chapter. Okay, God gave the king of Judah into the hands of the king of Babylon. God gave Daniel favor and compassion. God gave Daniel and his 3 friends abilities. This story and this word gave, repeated 3 times, is very, very important. Whenever you see a word in the Bible, so I want to give you a tip. Whenever you see a word in the Bible repeated several times over and over again, that is a word to pay careful attention to. The author of that book is trying to make a point. The author is trying to emphasize something, a lesson to be learned from that one word. And we see that from this word gave, which ultimately shows us that God is in control. And that's a lesson we've learned in some of these past stories with Elisha and with Gideon, that God is in control, even in this very hard time in which his people are in exile. And this is a great reminder for us right now, that God is in control of our lives. With all that's going on in the world around us, with COVID-19, it's not in control. The coronavirus is not in control. People aren't in control. The weather is not in control. But only God is in control. And we learn that specifically from Daniel chapter 1 in Daniel's first story from this word gave. So that's what we learn about God from this story. But now I want to give us a lesson that we learn something about our relationship to God. So just like Daniel didn't eat the king's food because it would have been sin, we must not give in to the sins around us. So it can be very tempting if all of your friends are doing something that is wrong for you to join in. Also, think of Daniel. He was away from his family and friends. They wouldn't have known if he would have decided to sin, if he would have decided to act in this way. Isn't it tempting when your parents aren't around for you to disobey? The king's food probably tasted good, so Daniel would have really enjoyed this sin. And yet, Daniel was not willing. We learn from this that we are not to give in to the sins around us. We need to pray to God to ask him to help us to not do these things, to live in a way that is honoring and pleasing to him, and not like the world around us. So that's our first story about Daniel. Next week, we're going to look at a second similar that's a bit similar. We're going to look at Daniel chapter 6, and we're going to learn another story that I think this time you guys are going to be pretty familiar with. And in the weeks to come, we're actually going to meet some of the other characters that are mentioned in the book of Daniel. So I'll see you guys next time.